Welcome to another episode of Electable. I'm Deb Chubb, and this podcast is sponsored by the Indiana Women's Action Movement. So today we are really lucky to be joined by Michael Hicks from Ball State University to talk about his very intensive study of the Indiana economy and its development between 2010 and 2019. There's been some articles published and a terrific report. And I just want to mention a little bit about Michael, because I think this is really just great to know that we have this terrific educational institution in Indiana doing such great work. So Michael Hicks is the director of Ball State Center for Business and Economic Research and the George and Frances Ball Distinguished Professor of Economics in the Miller College of Business. His research interest is in state and local public finance and the effect of public policy on the location, composition, and size of economic activity. Professor Hicks earned his doctoral and master's degree from University of Tennessee and a bachelor's from Virginia Military Institute. He's a retired Army Reserve infantryman. Sorry about that. So welcome, Michael. Thank you so much for being on this podcast.
Deb, it's good to be with you.
I'm very excited about this conversation because this is really great. I love talking about public policy in Indiana, and this really just covers so many policy areas. So I'd like you to kind of just briefly describe your report on the economy. I know it's much more in depth than I'm giving time for, but right. There's so many other things that I want to talk about that go into your findings, because you did a great job of really detailing the cause of the developments in Indiana. So if you could just kind of give us a quick recap of the findings from your report.
Right, great question. What I tried to do in this work is to lay out a decade or longer of Indiana's economy. Many people think that this has just been a great decade. The Indiana economy has just been, improving in all, cylinders. Everything is great, and that just is. There's no evidence that is the case. And so instead of sort of attacking hyperbole, I just went back to look at the data, and I wanted to, in this work, sort of lay out several different things. The first one is that the Indiana economy, and particularly in that long recovery from from July 1st to 2009 till the end of January of 2020, which was the longest expansion in U.S. history, the Indiana's economy underperformed on every critical metric. Our per capita income growth was slower than the nation as a whole, so we're well below the nation, so it's running away. Our productivity growth in manufacturing has been above the national average, and that's now reversing, that we're moving the wrong way. The types of jobs that are being created in Indiana are very heavily concentrated amongst the least skilled workers, and so we're slipping away from our once fairly dominant economic position. And I just go back to point out that back in 1970 we had the 17th highest average wage per job, and we're like 34th or 35th now, in terms of, and the things that drive, the second part was then what are the things that drive these bad outcomes? And they're really linked to the educational performance of our population. So Indiana, which has a below average educational attainment in terms of adults with a college degree, an advanced degree, post-secondary preparation for the trades or some other occupation, or even just high school graduates as a share of the workforce, are all below the national average. And instead of, if you're below the national average, you might hope that you would catch up over the coming decade of economic expansion when tax revenues were growing and there was plenty of opportunity to do so. Instead, we slipped farther behind the U.S. on each and every one of those metrics. And so while we're getting better, our per capita income is growing, but much more slowly than the nation as a whole. Our education attainment is getting, up until 2019, was getting better, but much more slowly than the nation as a whole. And so that means that the average American is doing a lot better than us right now, and then growing at a faster rate. All these measures are getting better, and so we're moving farther and farther behind. And I've been calling this the Mississippi strategy, because Mississippi comes in last in most of these metrics, and we're moving in that direction. And some of the really key measures, like just the raw number of bachelor's degree as a share of the workforce, that's a really important work category. We're 44th in the country. And so, we have a lot of colleges here, so we have more advanced degrees, and big medical presence, that sort of thing. But in the core thing that would drive a technology business to expand here, or a new corporate headquarters like Amazon to move here, the things that the state government says they want, we're just farther behind. And so then at the end of this study, I try to say, the only way we're going to get better on these measures in the next decade or 2 or 3 is to actually get better at the fundamentals, have better schools, a higher share of our students go on to post-secondary education, a higher proportion of them graduate. And while this is a complex thing, spending on these things do play an outsized role in delivering quality.
All right, that's great. That is a great summary of your report. So again, I like to go back to talking about low taxes. The agenda has been keep taxes low, be the lowest corporate tax rate in the country, and then we did see, as you pointed out in your report, increase in manufacturers, but as you just pointed out, a reduction in educational attainment. So, and you talk about that at length, about the brain drain, people leaving, and the leaver gap, those leaving having a higher educational attainment than those coming in, and then really the cat gets out of the bag when you start talking about manufacturing productivity and the lack of growth there. And you mentioned in your report the Pew study that really showed that Indiana was 10 years behind in their technology manufacturing or their technology industries in Indiana, that we just have not kept up with the digital technology skills and investment that many other states have been putting into their human capital, which I love that term. I love, and I want to talk about that a little bit too. So yeah, so now we've seen all of these impacts, and we see why we are not doing better than we are economically. But you kind of say at one point, the bottom line is it's the human capital, and it's the investment in human capital. So if you could just kind of describe that term for us, I think it's a bit. I know it's complex, but if you could give us a little bit of an idea. I mean, as you said before, capital investment is buildings and things and equipment, but let's talk about what's human capital.
Right. Good question. We use these terms in economics, and I apologize to everybody. They're sort of a technical term that we like to think about it. So, physical capital for production is stuff like the machinery at a factory, the computers, the technology, the building that you have, the Zoom technology that we're working on now. And then there's public capital, roads, bridges, school buildings, things like that deliver some public service that comes from them. And people have been investing in these for thousands of years. Here in the United States, we have obviously a lot of investment in roads, bridges, water, sewer systems, and those sorts of things. And when we make investments in those, we think about a rate of return. What's that going to generate? And is the benefits going to exceed the cost of borrowing for local governments or for a business? That's the really hard-headed business solution to doing capital investment. But for human, and then we have workers, but really economists now, the big work in what causes economic growth has been about human capital for almost 50 years now. And that argues that what really causes the differences in growth between the US and say Ghana, or between New York and Mississippi, is human capital, some measure of the quality of the workforce. And that's a hard thing to get your arm around, because it's not, we usually proxy this by formal educational attainment, but I always chuckle because anybody who thinks that just a formal educational attainment is a good measure of human capital has never been to a faculty meeting, right? And so, but just years of schooling is a fairly good proxy for the number of workers that are there. Formal years of schooling, maybe a couple of measures of threshold credentialing, like a bachelor's degree or high school graduates. Measures of overall health are important. Workers that are just small differences in health individually cause a drop off in productivity, particularly in later years as workers are gone for more days. So those are all human capital measures that we use in our mathematical models. But when we think about investment in them, what we're thinking about is, early childhood education, a really fine elementary school, high quality transition to secondary education at the high school level, a comprehensive college prep type high school, availability of trade or workforce training for students who choose not to go on to college, but done near the end of their high school, not at the beginning of their preparation for secondary education, as Indiana has done. And then the abundance of post-secondary options, everything from can you immediately enter a plumber's apprentice program somewhere to what types of colleges and universities do you have, and then what share of adults go into them and graduate, and even more important than that, how is the access across domains? Because the big untapped human capital is always the poor but capable child who could go on to college but doesn't see a path there. They don't have a family member who's a college graduate. They don't have financial access to it. And if they did, one little problem in school, an illness at the end of your sophomore first semester could throw you out of school because you can't afford to it, or you have to repeat a class in the summer and you don't have time to do that. So those are the things when economists talk about human capital that we think of. And the reason we use that word capital is that these things are enduring. And what's interesting about them is, unlike an investment in a road or a bridge or a piece of technology, the value of that decays over time. It weakens. And so the road needs to be repaired, the machinery becomes obsolete or worn out, and then you replace it. That's the depreciation problem. Human capital generally does not depreciate. It generally appreciates over most of a working lifespan. And so that's why an investment in an early childhood education today for some share of children is something that's going to be persistently obvious in the data 40 or 50 years from now, because you will be able to look back at those students and see that as they reach adulthood, their educational outcomes are better, their human capital is stronger across all kinds of domains. And then it strengthens over the rest of their lifetime. And then it starts to decay when you start getting my age and you start getting, forgetful, or you replace those formal skills that you acquired in school with some savvy elsewhere. So that's a difference. That's a shocking difference. When we invest in physical capital, we anticipate it's going to decay. So its long-term benefits are smaller. When you invest in human capital, it typically doesn't decay, and that's would argue for much more investment than we have now.
Well, that's great. So, okay, so you pointed out in your report that public education spending between 2009 and 2019 shrank by 1.28 billion per year. So, and is there some, calculation that's bringing that to present dollars, or is that just raw data? That's just a raw number.
No, that's in constant dollars. So I put everything in 2020 2019 or 2020 dollars, just to make comparisons. We always sort of do that. And so the way to think about that was, if Indiana had spent the same share of its income on education, or its GDP on education, in 2019 than we did in 2009, then we would be spending another $1.8 billion a year, which is roughly 30% more on education. We would be more like Ohio if we did that. We would be spending about 20 to 30% more on public education. And public education, we spend money on charters, vouchers, transfers, those. So I'm not picking one silo school. All those are a benefit. And that, I think, is at the root of much of our problem, is that we went through a big school choice shock to the system. I think there's a preliminary evidence that that was generally good across the board. And then instead of exploiting the opportunities from that by making sure that everything got better, we said, well, that having school choice is a substitute for spending instead of a complement to higher spending. And so now we're going to cut spending. And I think we're now bearing the bitter fruit of that. And the most obvious place that we can see that in the data is that the share of our adults going off to post-secondary education really started to decline in about 2015 and is much lower now than it was, that time ago. And that what that means is that not only are we not then improving our human capital effectively in Indiana, we're actually moving away from the national average, not moving towards it. And that's a shocking, when you're 38th or 39th in educational attainment, as we are in Indiana, and you're now making discrete policy choices that inevitably cause you to move farther to the back of the line. I mean, we're right under Puerto Rico. We're right under Puerto Rico in our share of adults with a college degree. Indiana is right under Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a fine place, but most Hoosiers probably would not set that location as one that is aspirational with respect to education, but indeed it is. And so I think that's really the very counter to the narrative that you hear about this supercharged advanced economy. And that's just not really what we observe. And maybe the best way to see that is, despite the almost gloating about the performance of Indiana's manufacturing economy, since 2000, the only type of jobs that have grown in manufacturing, the only educational attainment category that is higher today than it was 20 years ago in Indiana manufacturing are for workers with less than a high school diploma. So these are high school dropouts are doing better. In every other category, we're well down across the board. And so if that's our strong industry, if that's the industry we have to focus on, we're in desperate trouble.
Right. I mean, because what goes along with that is that those people who are, growing in number are living less well, are depending more on government subsidies. I think you heard somewhere that Walmart's one of the biggest employers of SNAP recipients. So they're the working poor who have all kinds of other problems, end up with much higher rates of health problems, probably less access to higher education. We'll talk about that a little bit later, because I do want to talk about how these policies impact rural areas in particular. Yes, that is the experience that I've had on the school board. Is this kind of this is my new word of the day, hysteresis. So I used to say that I felt like, as a school board member, our school corporations were being yanked from here to China and back. And now I can say that we are suffering from hysteresis, which is that's the definition of being yanked from here to China and back. But when you talk about these policies and the investment in education, politically speaking, it's been awful. It's been difficult. You make these points. I mean, it's common sense that you have to invest in education to get a well-trained and well-skilled workforce and to improve the economy. But the response often from the Republican supermajority is, well, we spend half of our budget on education. So I guess, I guess there's no way, at least easily, to compare that to the costs that money they're giving up by these constant tax cuts, which we have gotten again in this year, that go over, that kind of are staggered up, a little higher over the next 3 or 4 years. So how do you say that in policy terms, that makes sense? Because that's always the response, that, well, half of our budget goes to K-12 education. How do you say, well, now's the time to invest in that and make it higher than half of our budget?
Right. I say that's both true and irrelevant that half of our budget is going to education. I think a lot of the financing debate about schools tends to devolve on the challenges, naturally, of course, to devolve on the challenges naturally of hiring good teachers, promoting and retaining good teachers, ensuring that you have a small classroom, ensuring that there are other supplemental experiences for children, that the outcomes are good, that that experience is good, and that if budgets are cut, those become highly problematic, and it's very difficult for school corporations to raise money in a state that's over average age. You can run a referendum, but most people don't have children in the school system, so it's very difficult to get to the other side of that referendum process, and so. And then as a parent, your time that you worry about schools is, short. If you have, my youngest graduates this year, so I'm going to lose my bubble of concern over the local public schools. I'll care about schools in general, but I'm not going to be involved in, are they wearing masks today or what's their spring break schedule. And so I think those are important discussions to have, but the real policy discussion that I think should animate a General Assembly made up of conservative Republicans is that having poor educational outcomes is bad for business. It's bad for gross domestic product growth. It's bad for the environment of a state that aspires to have high quality employers in the state. So I try to make a lot of my argument in that way. There's a lot of ways to skin the cat on this, and I'm not suggesting mine is best. It hasn't been successful, perhaps, and so that maybe you should judge that. But what I do like to do is to say, when you're thinking about Indiana's taxes now on manufacturing are fourth lowest in the country. And yet we've lost 150,000 manufacturing jobs in 20 years. We went from being 24th in 2000 up to 38th highest in 2006 when Governor Daniels was elected. We're now down to fourth highest. So, and I think we're being beaten by like places that don't have manufacturing, like Vermont and Alaska and Hawaii. So in reality, this is, from a purely fiscal basis, is the best place to locate a manufacturing, but manufacturers aren't coming here. They're not hiring people. Why is that? Well, it's because they don't have the people that they need here. So Intel just chose Ohio, right?
Well, and how about our own Eli Lilly, who chose
Eli
North
Lilly,
Carolina?
And I hate to say, the fact that Eli Lilly went to North Carolina sounds an awful lot to me like the signal that was being given by Ball Corporation to Muncie in the 1980s and 1990s, which was saying, you better fix your schools, you better make a place where I can bring my corporate headquarter employees here, because it's really hard to get people to want to move to this neighborhood because the quality of life isn't very robust. So you don't have good schools here in Muncie. And they did that or you go to Lincoln National, which left Fort Wayne in the 1990s as well, for over a decade, said, look, I need better schools. I need a place that people want to live. I need to do something. And after 10 years, the CEO got up and announced, we're leaving. And I've complained every year at these chamber meetings in front of the mayor, in front of the school board for 10 years, and nothing has changed. And so the Eli Lilly's thing, there's no Hoosier name there's no name of any corporation that's more Hoosier than Eli Lilly. And yet that they said, we're not going to make this stuff here in Indiana. We're going to go to North Carolina, right? A state that in 1970 was a backward, second, it just horrible 1970, but they've been able to pull educational attainment way up. So there's no place in Indiana for an Intel or an Amazon or an Eli Lilly factory to go to do these sorts of things. And yet there are, and I would just point out that Ohio spends a smaller share of their tax dollars on education, but it's more money, right? So they're spending 20 cents more on every dollar, 20% more overall per student than we are in Indiana on higher education and K through 12. And so that's what's driving the movement of commerce to those places. And so, you can cherry pick a 2-year period where Indiana outperformed somebody else because the RVs grew or something else, which is kind of what you get in a state of the state address, but an honest assessment of where we are. Pick any date, pick 2 or 3 dates around it, make a comparison. And Indiana has just underperformed on every key measure. I just don't want to add, everybody wants people without a high school degree to get a better job. That's one of the best ways to improve your human capital, is to get a job, work hard. Your employer, if he or she is a decent manager, is going to do things that give you better skill sets, make it more likely that you can have a better career. So I'm not dismissing, and these are important citizens who haven't completed high school. Many of them are immigrants. They're from ethnic minority like the Amish that are don't finish school. So I'm not suggesting these aren't people that we should care about. But if your economy is being dominated by growth in this area, which is very susceptible to a labor demand shock because of automation or trade, then you're really setting yourself up to be clobbered in the next decade or two. And that's where Indiana is right now in 2022, setting itself up for a real difficult decade or two economically.
So I think I was even impressed with your figures in the report that, connected higher education to better pay and better jobs. I mean, we all kind of know that intuitively, but it seemed like, I can't remember the number now, but it seemed like incredibly high. I mean, super high correlation.
Yeah. I think I try to tell people so I'm a college professor. A lot of people say, "Oh, it's you're just pushing college." Like, look, you have no idea how unconnected I am to the number of students that we have coming through the university and the work that I do. The real fact is that there are 2 big factors in educational attainment that people ought to care of. The first one is just if you want to see how rich a state is in terms of its average income, about 70% of the difference in each state is explained by the share of adults who have a bachelor's degree. So you go from 25% adults with a bachelor's degree to 30%, then you're going to go from the below average to near the average of states in income. That's $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a year. Now, a lot of that's being driven simply by the more productivity that's attached to college graduates. And again, productivity is often considered a loaded word. I'm talking about dollars produced per worker in a county or a state or an industry. There's nothing fancy to it. Nothing other than that, just dollars produced per year per factory. And so the lowest states, Mississippi, we're like 6th or 7th, right? So where we have lower productivity than, which is crazy because we're dominated by a high productivity industry, which is manufacturing. So we shouldn't be that bad. So we're under Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Ohio. We're worse than all of those, both in educational attainment and worker productivity. But there's another piece of this that people miss is if you don't have a college degree, the place that will give you the highest income is to be in a office or a factory or a county that has a higher share of college graduates. So the number of college graduates actually drive the overall regional productivity up through some sort of spillovers. We don't know exactly why that is. We think that there are workers of different skill levels act as complements, and in places that you have too many poorly educated workers, the businesses are not forming there to match them with a lot of college graduates. And so it's not I'm not making an elitist argument. What I'm saying is you send more kids to college, primarily poor kids, kids who've done less well in school. That's where the untapped human capital is. It's not a guy like me, upper middle class, family, didn't do great in high school, went to college and sort of bloomed later. Those kids go to college. It's the high performing kid in the lower 25% of income who could do really well at college, who could really have a fine opportunity, just doesn't get there. They're here in Indiana, we tout programs that generally don't do a lot for us, like the 21st Century program, because
I wanted to ask you about that specifically.
Right,
if you could talk about the outcomes of that, because great idea, but
yes.
For whatever reason, and I don't know, what the actual numbers are, but my, just anecdotal experience is that so many people who qualify for that fail to sign up because, you have to sign up during middle school
right.
for this.
So
you can't, if you don't do it, then you're out.
Yeah,
and the benefit, of course, is huge if
right.
you sign up in time. So am I right that it's not really I mean, it's not happening. The people, people are not really benefiting from that program. Oh, on a big spectrum.
Right. So, I mean, you're exactly right. 21st century program on paper looks fantastic. You sign up early, you make a promise not to get in trouble, do drugs, do any of that sort of stuff. And at 13, if you sign up and you keep your grades above a C, you go to college and we'll pay college tuition. And you still got to pay room and board, but we'll pay college tuition. A lot of times universities will kick in money to it. Those are the students they really want with that. Sounds superb, right? The problem is you got to sign up at 13. Right. So unless the middle school is really pushing this, and if you've been a parent of a middle schooler, the number of times you're going to get that green Mimeo sheet of paper coming in their backpack, it's going to end up on the kitchen table, is small in the best of households. Unless you have really good connection with that, you're not going to have high take rates. The things that would cause a family to be eligible for this in the first place are likely to also make it less likely that they'll sign up, right? If you're a single parent, if you have low literacy skills, if you don't speak English well, if you're, if all of those things make it less likely that green announcement sheet that's supposed to come home in the backpack is going to end up on your kitchen table, and mom or dad's going to have time to deal with it, to sign up. So that's problem one, is we just have too few kids that know about it, and they make mistakes, and 5 years later you're not in the system and you're in trouble. That's problem one. Problem two is the restrictions on what could happen to you are so much that it just winnows out a lot, particularly boys, right? So your things that something like 80 or 90% of children do in high school behavioral wise could get you knocked out of this program. And so I just got to be frank with you, I wouldn't have been eligible for it for the trouble I got into high school. I had a fairly respectable college and academic career. My father, who was a well-known scientist, wouldn't have been, and none of my children would have been. And they're at an Air Force Academy graduate, a BMI junior, and one heading off to West Point in the fall. So if kids like that, or me or my dad, couldn't make it because of some mistakes that we made in high school, that other institutions said, I will still take you, would knock you out of being able to go to Indiana State on a 21st century program. The program is not doing what it was designed to do. And because it's going to cost money, there's real pushback at doing things that would enable kids to go. And don't get me wrong, there are many pathways to go to college if you're poor. You can join the military, there's GI Bill. Those kids who do that ain't coming back to Indiana. So if you're in South Bend and you're a poor young man and you're smart and you really want to go to college, there's a nice 2-year enlistment in the Army today that you can walk out with a GI Bill. I have a PhD on the GI Bill. My father had a PhD in the GI Bill. Those people are not coming back to Indiana. So you're losing they're going to go to 29 Palms to join the Marines, or they're going to Lackland Air Force Base to join the Air Force, or maybe they're going to Oklahoma for Navy basic training, and they're never coming back. And so it is really the goal of a human capital policy, is to see how many of our kids can we get into high quality educational opportunities post-secondary, because that's really the entry level position. The study talked a little bit about it. 8 out of 10 of all the net new jobs created in the United States over any time period of the last 30 years, either 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, have gone to college graduates. Let me say that again. 80% of all the net job growth has gone to college graduates. The other 20% of net job growth has gone to people who either have an associate's degree or some post-secondary collegiate experience. So they've been to 2 years of college, they have a manufacturing technology degree. So 100% of all the net job growth in the United States combined has gone to people with a bachelor's who have been to college and earned a degree. And so if you're graduating from high school today and you have no post-secondary educational plans, or you don't graduate from high school, there will be fewer jobs available for you in 10 years and 20 years and 30 years. That's not turning the corner. More human capital is going to be needed by businesses down the road. And so if we have an educational system that's not telling every kid at 18, you're not done yet, young man or young woman, you need to do something else. 100% of kids, we should be graduating no kids, almost no kids. And I'm going to be honest, is some just aren't going to go. But we should be graduating no kids from high school who aren't ready to go to college or a really high quality internship program down the road. And that's what we're failing in big numbers, I think.
Okay, two questions. So one of them is, two problems with that, that ideal pathway. One is, are we graduating kids that are ready for college? And the other is, if we are, access to higher education is just financially so much less attainable than it was when I was young. I know when I was young, I know my mom used to say anybody can go to a state school. You can get, you can pay for it. You can find a Pell Grant. But it, in the years after I was that age, it has just skyrocketed. So the cost of higher education is such a challenge, and I think it's become, it's just become part of the culture now that we know that it's going to be out of reach for, particularly low income families and even moderate income families. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, huge sticker shock on school. There are a couple of points to it. The first one is, and I support putting pressure on the college and universities to do things about that. The actual instructional cost of a college or university, at Purdue or Ball State or IU, or just to pick those big three, are really about where they were in inflation-adjusted terms 10 or 15 years ago. So the way the tuition growth is really dampened here. And it's true nationwide. The real extra cost of college is the other stuff. The big one is the opportunity cost you give up in having a job, because a high school graduate could earn $25,000, $30,000 a year. So if you just go to college and you're not working, that's $100,000 to $160,000 you give up from not working. Then the second one is just the cost of living has really skyrocketed. Part of that's due to colleges overbuilding dorms. Making luxury, sort of nicely appointed dorms. But I think the real cost is just providing, meals and doing that sort of thing with it, because most kids don't live in those expensive dorms. They go to kids who are willing to can pay that full price to have the really fancy dorm. And so, in general, I'm not, I know it's expensive to go to college. The rate of return on it is so high that for most people who go are going to see a really big financial benefit from it. Now, where that's not true is in about three locations. One is if you spend a lot of money to get a very low demand major, right? So, and for low demand major, there are not that many of them. But if you have accrued $100,000 debt to get a degree in a major that the major itself isn't what gets you the job. There's some other talent. So think, music.
Well, I'll say philosophy. Like my college age kid came home and said he wanted to change his major to philosophy.
Right.
Like,
well, philosophy does well if you have a law degree at the end of it. That's a big one. Or and this has been it's a problem that's really no longer the case, is that there are a number of kids who were duped by a big for-profit college system, number of big for-profit college systems that didn't really get them the credentials they needed to get out. And then the third one is, and I think a lot of kids are in remediation. The sort of sad truth here in Indiana is about half of what Ivy Tech does is remedial education for high school and middle school. So we spend about $1 billion a year in both Ivy Tech and workforce development. And almost about half of that is allocated to sort of pre-algebra, algebra 1, middle school science, measurement, and reading. And so having a better K through 12 system, one that's less stressed with other add-ons, is probably a path to fixing that. So to some degree, and you would know this as a school board president, is that what we often find is that kids that aren't prepared when they leave high school, it's not that they didn't pay attention in calculus their senior year in high school. It's that they entered high school behind. They didn't have the skills they needed in middle school to be successful in high school. So they entered high school already not likely to get out of it with the success that they needed. And I think too often we clutter an education with a lot of bells and whistles that we think are important, that end up, just an example to throw one out is, teaching breast self-exams to middle schoolers. And I think it was in Florida. Like, I think health training, health education is really good, but, an hour class, on that, when the risk to benefit of that compared to some more fundamental thing is very, very small. So I think it's very easy to have the legislature cluttered education with a lot of non-essential tasks that we could do a lot better removing them. And that's not an argument against arts and other things. Right. It's an argument for being better at a smaller core of things, and then after school expanding your knowledge.
Yeah, and I think there's plenty of evidence showing the importance of arts and music to other education. But I do want to ask you about testing, because when you talk about things that really distract a school day, a lesson plan, and a unit, as teachers say, a lot of it is the intensive testing. Sure, I get it that, we need to see what the outcomes are. We need to see where we are. We need to measure, what's happening. We can't, you can't fix something that you can't measure, all of that. But it is, in my experience as a school board member, I'm not president of the school board, by the way, I'm just school. That kind of distraction, that kind of stress on teachers and students, really, that is one of the biggest distractions that I hear about all the time. The amount of time that teachers have to take to prepare students to take the test, to make sure the students know how to use their cursor to drop and drag, and or drag and drop or whatever, all those things. And then of course, that system changes all of the time back to our hysteresis impact that really does distract from curriculum. And I don't know, how do you feel like that? Where's the tipping point? Where is the threshold of testing being effective and important and useful, and the detrimental impact on actually, teaching kids?
So, great question. So No Child Left Behind did one thing that's really critical to American education, is that it forced every school in the country to be honest about its own performance. And what that did was open up the eyes of a number of people. So the example that I have is in Tennessee, where I went to graduate school. When No Child Left Behind was passed, the state did a couple of years of its own testing where 75% of their kids were meeting their literacy requirements. And then they adopted another test that would allow them that was a nationally calibrated test. And when they did that, they found only a quarter of their children met literacy requirements, far below the national average. And so tests, using some sort of testing measure that's objective across schools, gives you maybe not a national comparison, but at least a interstate comparison of school quality that was really not available when, in the 1980s, when people were complaining about, say, Muncie Community Schools, there was no very objective standard by which to present evidence about that performance. And I can just tell you, as a kid who changed schools in high school in the 1970s, right, there are huge differences between schools, and you can't tell unless you have some sort of objective measure. That objective measure, No Child Left Behind, which really forced states and schools to be honest about what's going on, at the same time, that test measure became a management performance goal, and any management performance goal that was any test, any an assessment that becomes a management performance goal is no longer a good assessment. And so I think to some degree the quality of the testing as a diagnostic tool dropped off because of their variety of reasons, from how we prep kids and that sort of thing. At the same time, we've loaded them with a lot of extra tests. And so, a test a year that takes a day it's hard to make a compelling argument that that's a problem. We're average going to run 3 or 4 snow days. But so many schools now have multiple tests along the way to prep up for that. They take diagnostic tests. They take a secondary test that measures some other, like a cognitive ability of the child. Then you have to pass 4 threshold tests in high school to get out, but 100% of kids that don't pass those tests still graduate from high school through some waiver program.
Right.
And so what you see is, if you can't pass the I-STEP, you have to take the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery and get a 25 on that or something like that. So I think there are what you observe when we're well past the point where the sort of multiplicity of tests are generating any real net benefit to us. I still think there needs to be some sort of objective measure. It could be in a much smaller set of things. It could be a national test that's administered, each year over a week-long period that every kid. That's sort of what happens in Europe, is that you take a diagnostic test, and you could take it several times, so that it's not high stakes. If you have allergy that day, it doesn't kill you. But some sort of testing is going to be around in schools. But I think the consensus says it's gone too far, and it would be better for students to maybe spend more time on their learning and less time on the evaluation. And I will say that I know a lot of schools, and this was interesting because we're right at the point 2 years ago where COVID closed schools around the state. This was spring break 2 years ago, and it was canceled. And that sort of, what's interesting about it is the learning loss over the next year wouldn't have been very bad, because the instruction mostly ends at spring break. Most people don't know that much instruction ends in Indiana at spring break. Maybe you do a week after that, and then all the rest of your time is AP prep for high school kids, or prepping to finish that last I-STEP that you didn't take. And so, to say that a quarter of the year's over, 3/4 of the way through for test prep, to me, I think suggests a systemic problem.
Yeah, that seems a little excessive. So that's great. And and I want to get your take on certainly my position about early childhood education, which you've mentioned before, the benefits of early childhood education on outcomes, adult outcomes. And I was in that industry for many years and saw many studies showing a return on investment of between $7 and $13 for every dollar invested in early childhood education. And it's everything. It's as you mentioned, the high remediation cost in Indiana, as far as lower teen pregnancy, longer marriages, higher pay, are all associated with pre-K education. So, and it would add, a lot to the K-12 budget to include now, 3 to 5 year olds. So another kind of 3 years of education for all students. So, but tell me why it's still a great idea.
Yeah. So just on the cost, it would cost about as much as the tax cut we're getting next year. So it's not really a big cost issue. It seems like it to the General Assembly, but in terms of marginal benefit, it's relatively small. So there are, I think, a long history of very high quality research that suggests that early childhood education benefits a large proportion of students, not 2/3, maybe not even half, but about 1/3 of kids. And so kids that have something at home that's not working for them and preparing them for primary school. And these could be things as simple as a parent who speaks another language, doesn't speak English. It could be just a single parent who's working and not able to be with them as much, and so they can't provide them that supplementary nurturing stuff that helps you read. It could be another sibling that requires a lot of parental time because they're disabled, right? A poverty where they just don't have access to supplementary things that are expensive, the things that cause you to grow in that area. And so maybe 1/3 of kids would benefit from this. The other 2/3, maybe not as much. They're already getting it because they got a stay-at-home mom, or their parents can pay for it. So we're really talking about 1 out of 3 kids. That's about 30,000 kids a year in Indiana over 3 years. So it's a few $100,000 for a few hours a day to do that. A few $100 million. Again, smaller than the cut that we have. So here, the benefits are that first year, there's not big benefits necessarily, except maybe the mom can now work and be productive in the economy. The big benefits come later, and they start with just better attendance in school, more likelihood to be reading by 3rd grade, much higher likelihood to be reading by 3rd grade, a better transition to secondary education. They do better at middle school, higher high school graduation rates, lower teen pregnancy rates, less, particularly for boys, less probability of being suspended in high school, a much smaller chance of being incarcerated. Not many people are incarcerated, but it's really expensive to be incarcerated. So if 1 out of 100 of these kids that would have gone to jail for 6 months is not, that's a $70,000 a kid savings. Big benefit from that. Higher probability of post-secondary education, higher probability of graduation, higher probability of having a full-time job, higher probability of family formation, and the sort of golden sequence of finishing school, getting married, and then having children, or finishing school, having a job, and then having children. There's different takes on it, are likely with this. And so the benefits that you talk about, $7 to $13, particularly for the really the poorest or the most challenged of the kids, by the time you start getting to a third, maybe that drops to $4 to $6 benefit. There's no investment that you can make you could get $4 to $6 in present value. But if you could, let me know. I have a huge retirement fund that I would like to cash in to get that. And so in terms of public investment dollars, when you're getting a penny of investment value on a new road, or you're getting a negative value on a tax cut because you already have really low taxes, those things really matter. There's diminishing returns. If you had universal pre-K and that sort of thing, then that's really expensive, and there's a lot fewer kids that benefit. So even in places like Sweden that have that, only 60% or so kids take it because their parents are staying home with them. They wish a different experience with it. So I'm not suggesting that the state's doing this. It's really providing a low cost supplement to what families are trying to do. And the really best of these programs, the Perry Preschool and Abecedarian, also have parent programs. And we're doing that in Muncie, where the preschool, the early childhood education investments are targeting parents as much, so that parents are getting classes on here's how these are the things you need to know by the time you show up to kindergarten to be ready to learn. So here's how you make sure your kids know their colors, their numbers, their letters, and that sort of thing. And to be quite candid, I was a parent. I knew my wife knew all that stuff, but I didn't know any of that stuff. So it's not something that most parents wouldn't benefit from taking instruction on. But that's one of the big bangs for the buck, is just helping parents do this. It's not, they're not doing crazy stuff. It's just, how do you make sure your kids reinforce learning colors and numbers, and how do they learn to interact with other people, and all that sort of stuff, sort of growing up. And it's very helpful, I think, in an environment where we all admit that one of the big challenges for poorer income families are the absence of a 2-parent household. And this is some way of mitigating the ill effects of that.
Yep, it does make a difference. So, okay, so I'm sorry we didn't get to as many things as I want, but we are running out of time. But I guess I just want to ask, what is the number? So what is the number? What is the dollar amount that we need to invest in education, pre-K as well as K-12, to really move the needle in terms of, higher incomes and productivity growth that would, put us better than, fourth last?
Yeah, I think we need to send about 10,000 more children a year. We have about 80,000 kids turn 19 each year, and about half, 54% of those go on to some sort of college, and about half of them graduate. So that's going to keep us moving towards Mississippi. I think we need to have another 10,000 of those children, young adults, go to college, and about half of those graduate from a four-year institution. To do that, I think it's going to cost the better part of $1 billion from pre-K, because that's where it starts, right? By third, if you ask any third grade teacher, they can tell you which one of their kids are going to not graduate from high school, right? So the fact that, think about the poverty of American public policy, that you can look at an 8-year-old and teachers can with huge success predict which ones are not going to graduate from high school. And so about $1 billion a year. We might get by with 800 million. We would do better with $1.2 billion a year. That would put us closer to what Ohio is spending on a per capita basis or per student basis for schooling. And I think that's really what we're talking about, which is far less than we paid as a share of our gross domestic product back in 2009. It still would be a tax cut from 2009 on Hoosier families. It's just that our tax reduction has been so deep across the board that we're really now being taxed right among the lowest states in the country, and we're getting the outcomes that we don't want as a consequence of that.
Great. Well, I think that's a great point to end this on. I think that's very clear and a good directive. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for joining me and talking about this. This is really just fascinating work that you're doing, and I'm really proud that you're here in Indiana doing this great work and really talking about it. I appreciate that you really want to get this message out. So it is very important, and it is very important for all of us to hear from you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it, and my colleagues at the center appreciate that people are listening to the work that we are spending every day on here. So thank you.
Very good. All right. Thank you. Let's see.